It's my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. Across the world, we're beginning to see utility business model reformation and electricity sector regulatory framework modernization emerging as the key enabler and driver for electricity to shift from being a uniform commodity consumed by captive consumers to being a dynamic service that empowers life in the 21st century. There's good news on this front. Our new federal minister of natural resources, the Honorable Jim Carr, has been mandated to work with the provinces and territories to bring cleaner renewable energy onto a smarter electricity grid. The Ontario Energy Board is leading the way at the provincial level with their renewed regulatory framework process. Other provinces are also beginning to move down this path. I'm very pleased today to welcome Lisa Frantzis, Senior Vice President, Advanced Energy Economy, which I'm sure all of you know as AEE. I welcome her to deliver our opening keynote address on the critical role of utility reform in the transformation of the electricity sector, with special emphasis on leading jurisdictions in the United States, which Canada can look to for vision and best practices. The AEE is a national business association whose mission is to transform policy to ensure a more secure, clean, and affordable energy system through the U.S. At AEE, Lisa leads an initiative to accelerate the transition to a 21st century electricity system. Lisa has served as Managing Director in Navigant Consulting's energy practice since 2002, responsible for leading the renewable and distributed energy business. Prior to Navigant, she consulted at Arthur D. Little for 23 years in energy efficiency and clean energy. Lisa sits on numerous boards of directors, too numerous to list here, but a very impressive list. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Frantzis as our opening keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, John, and as well to CanSIA for giving me this opportunity to speak to you all today. I'm very excited about the topic that I'm going to be covering, and I'm just going to make sure I can get my slides up. I'm going to focus on transforming to a 21st century electricity system in Canada, but I'm going to start off my talk pretty much by focusing on the US because that's where I've been very actively engaged, and then I'll try to make linkages to Canada as well. First of all, John gave a brief introduction of AEE, but let me just give you a little more background on our organization. We're a business association. We're made up of large multinationals like GE, Landis+Gyr, Apple, Microsoft, but also startups. And our goal is really to bring these business voices together to begin to transform policy to enable the rapid growth of secure, clean, and affordable energy. This is our representation list of our Leadership Council members. It's a great group of folks. And we also work locally with our regional partners. We work across the United States, but our local partners are in 26 states, and we represent about 1,000 members. So my role, I came out of consulting. I loved what I was doing, but they lured me in to lead this 21st Century Electricity System initiative. And essentially what I've been doing over the past 2 years is bringing together CEOs of utilities with regulators and CEOs of our member companies to have small convenings, like 25, 30 people around a main table, really beginning to hash out some of these challenging issues around how are we going to achieve the 21st century electricity system. Following a few of these forums, we held 9 of them across the U.S. Following the ones in New York and in California, we actually worked side by side with utility companies and our members, hashing out white papers that we then presented to the Commission. So in New York, for example, prior to the the Reforming the Energy Vision proceeding, we wrote this white paper, which I think set the foundation for some of the key pieces that were in the straw proposal that came out. And then on top of that, we're actively filing comments on behalf of our members into some of these proceedings. Like in New York, we're filing comments on behalf of our members, and we also are doing the same in Minnesota. So that's background. So let's get into what's really happening. We have seen a transformation in the telecommunications industry it's no question that it's going to happen to the power sector. It's really just a question of when. And it is coming. We're seeing it happen in many states in the United States, and I'm sure you're starting to see pieces of it here in Canada. So what originally was about serving the customer with core attributes like safety, reliability, affordability, now we're seeing a lot of other things that our members and customers are demanding, right? They're concerned about environmental sustainability. They're concerned about resiliency, adaptability, flexibility. The customers want to engage more. They don't just want to sit passively, some of them, and they want more options. On top of that, we have a layer and a lot of pressures that are coming onto the power sector. They've got old and aging infrastructure that needs to be replaced. They have minimal to declining load growth as a result of the success of energy efficiency and other things that are taking place. A lot of renewables have come onto the grid, wind and solar, which are a bit intermittent that they've got to accommodate. And then cybersecurity and data security is becoming another issue. On top of that, we're seeing the deployment of distributed energy resources, which we're defining in our organization as solar, electric vehicles, storage, combined heat and power. And these are coming on and changing the dynamics of the power sector. You know, for 100 years, it used to be power from a central station power plant to the end use. Now we're seeing electric vehicles, energy efficiency, demand response, two-way power flow into the grid, more customer engagement, high DER penetration. This is creating a need to change the business model in the power sector. In the United States, on top of that, 40% of our carbon emissions in the US comes from stationary power plants, and we've got to reduce that. And Obama has issued the Clean Power Plan, which they wanted me to touch on today. We estimate that in replacing some of those coal plants, energy efficiency, solar, in addition to natural gas, will play a key role in this. And we're estimating that that market opportunity in the US is about $20 billion a year. So it's not insignificant at all. There's a huge opportunity for many of the members here to start playing in some of those markets. This slide just highlights which states, the orange ones in particular, have the biggest gap to fill in terms of 1,000 tons of carbon emissions between 2012 and 2030. So there's a real opportunity. We're expecting that if Clean Power Plan is a success, that carbon emissions can be reduced by 32% by 2030. Canada, you've been doing a lot of wonderful things at the province level as well around carbon pricing and carbon taxes in Alberta and British Columbia, the carbon taxes that are there in Ontario and Quebec, the cap and trade system. The point I just want to make about a lot of the carbon emissions and the Clean Power Plan in the US, they're great initiatives, but they're not going to be enough. They're going to help to reduce carbon reduction and greenhouse gas emissions, but for us in the US to meet our targets, we've got to do more. And to accommodate all the DER and the solar and these new technologies and innovations that are coming into the grid, we have to do more around the business models. So let me transfer now to talk a little bit about the transformation that's happening. And I'm going to focus on primarily New York, because I believe that's where the key, most comprehensive activity is taking place. But I wanted to list these other 5 states. So in the United States, these are the 5 states that are pretty much dealing the most with utility reform. California, they have their distribution resource plans. They have separate dockets that they're pursuing. And it's largely being driven by environmental policy, energy targets. They have a lot of renewables now that they're having to deal with in terms of resource adequacy. So they have dockets on energy storage. They have dockets on electric vehicles and proceedings on demand response and advanced metering infrastructure. They have another one out now, too, on integrated DER, or IDER. These are changing and moving forward, but they're not comprehensive. New York is sort of taking a comprehensive look at utility reform, and that's why I'm going to focus on that a little bit today. The grid modernization proceeding in Massachusetts. This is the distribution utilities in Massachusetts are required to file 10-year grid mod plans. There was filings that took place this past August in 2015. And essentially, what they have to do is they have to, one, show that they're going to be implementing, they get special cost recovery if they implement advanced metering functionality. And if they meet certain requirements to cost-benefit analysis, they also get additional benefits for that. But after they deploy AMF, then they're going to be moving toward time-varying rates. And that's going to be a key thing for helping solar and other distributed energy technologies in Massachusetts. Hawaii is being driven just because they've got so much solar coming on the grid, so their drivers for doing utility reform are slightly different than some of the other states. They have large amounts of photovoltaics, and they're having to deal with that through multiple orders and proceedings. And then Minnesota is largely driven by the utilities, which is sort of different than the other states as well. Xcel and others are pushing to have an E21 stakeholder process. It started this fall, and the guess is that it's going to be moving more toward performance-based regulation. Other states that are listed here that are about to do utility grid mod proceedings include the District of Columbia, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Pennsylvania. Actually, we just held a CEO forum. We've held 9 of them across the U.S. We just held one in New England with Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, and New Hampshire was there as well. And we're about to work with the utilities and our solar companies to begin to move forward on some discussions sort of around net metering and rate design, which is a very hot and heated topic right now. So let me shift to New York. New York has had a lot of attention. I think there are some pieces of it that might be very interesting and exciting to you, so I'm going to get into a bit of the details on it. So this is really what the driver is. You know, why did it start? Obviously, there's Hurricane Sandy, but they also looked at what is it going to cost to basically maintain the existing grid over the next 10 years. And they said it's going to cost $30 billion. Then they looked at the rates that have been increasing since 2004, so roughly over the last 10 years or so. And it was a 32% increase that they were seeing on customer rates on average. So, you know, they realized business as usual is not sustainable. We've got to do something. So they set these goals for REV, Reforming the Energy Vision, which is a proceeding that was launched a couple years ago that we've been very engaged in. One, they want to engage customers more. They want to animate the markets, let the markets do most instead of setting a lot of targets. They want to achieve system-wide efficiency. And one thing we've heard Chair Zibelman mention many times is, you know, we don't want to focus on just incenting solar or just incenting CHP. We want to look at incenting system efficiency. And how you get there, we don't care, but if you can achieve system efficiency, that's great. Fuel diversity, resource diversity, increased reliability and resiliency is also very important, and obviously reduced emissions. So they basically had 2 tracks initially. Track 1 was more about the vision of REV and where it's going. Track 2 was more about how the utilities can make money, and Track 3 now is about large-scale renewables. The Track 1 order came out in February of 2015. It established the utilities as this distributed system platform, or the DSP. And just to let folks know, originally there was a lot of discussion about should the utilities really be serving in this function. And I think the reason the Commission went down this path is they felt, one, we wanted the utilities on board and on board with REV early on, and so let's get them engaged. And to do that, they gave them the role of playing this. But if they don't meet certain performance targets, they will lose the capability of taking this function on and operating this distributed platform where all this DER is going to be sort of managed and brokered. The utility is also going to be required to provide system data as part of the order to third parties. And the reason I wanted to emphasize this is a key issue for our members. Our members said, look, the utilities have all this great data about the system and about the customers that could help us innovate products and services and will help us understand where we could put the DER on the grid. And without that, you know, we're clueless and we need more access to that information. So in Track 1, the Commission said, okay, the utilities have to provide the system data, but they did not commit to the customer data. And they were claiming essentially there are privacy issues there. We don't necessarily want to share that yet. And so that's still being negotiated. But I think Moving forward, this will allow for more product and service innovation. The other thing that they did, which is sort of unusual compared to some other states like Arizona, is the commission said the utilities, the regulated side of the business, cannot own a lot of DER assets, so they can't own a lot of solar. They can maybe do some of it in demo programs, but as part of day-to-day business, we're not going to allow it. And that really fostered the opportunity for third-party entities like yourselves to come in and play in the marketplace more. They increase the interconnection cap and streamline the application process, which makes it easier for the integration. And then they also directed the utilities to engage the third parties in their demonstration programs to encourage more innovation. So I thought this was great. This is track 1. We're now on to track 2, which is just a white paper that came out in July of 2015. We don't yet have the order, which will be coming soon. But essentially, this is how the utilities make money. And I'm going to get into some details here, and hopefully it won't bore you, but I think there's some interesting things that could be relevant to Canada. One, they said net metering is going to stay in place initially for the mass market. But beyond that, we've got to find something else beyond net metering. And this is becoming a very contentious topic, as you might imagine, throughout the U.S. and other states. In Arizona, it's coming up in New York, it's coming up in New England. Again, this is, selling back excess power at the retail rate versus wholesale rate of power, running your meter backward. The New York utility said, look, we're going to implement something called LMP plus D, locational marginal pricing plus distribution, but let's figure out what that D actually is. And in our organization, we've actually hired a consultant to begin helping frame what that could be in terms of a methodology, but there's a lot of discussion on what that plus D is. The goal ultimately is to move away from utility profits based on just capital investment. So the way utilities always have done business is we build a new coal plant, we get a regulated rate of return, and that's been focused very much on CapEx, capital investments. Now they're trying to say, let's figure out ways we can facilitate DER or OpEx and move the agenda forward. And that creates more opportunities for DER. So the 3 mechanisms that they have proposed in New York are shown here. The first one's a little bit of a mouthful. It's called the Modified Net Plant Reconciliation Mechanism, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but it's basically what's called a clawback mechanism, earning impact mechanisms, and then market-based earnings. And again, the shift is to move away from encouraging utilities to just do capital investments, to think about ways of rewarding operating expenses. So maybe now as a solar company, you want to sell ancillary services like VAR control, frequency regulation, capacity reduction. And maybe now the utility can get a regulated rate of return on that. Or maybe there's some other way that that can be valued in the marketplace. So let's talk. This is sort of the flow of how these 3 financing mechanisms are going to roll out. The modified clawback. So essentially this is, in the past, the regulators have allowed the utilities to get a regulated rate of return on capital investments. But if they don't spend it all, the commission has had the ability to come back and take some of that money back. But now they're saying, hey, if you don't spend all that capital money and the return on it, we'll let you keep that money as long as you invest it in distributed energy resources. And so this is something that they can immediately implement in the near term. The second is earning impact mechanisms. So this is essentially like performance-based rate making or performance-based incentives. So they're saying we'll give added benefit for you if you meet certain targets. And these are just categories. Now, these still have yet to be defined in terms of what the metrics are. We have filed comments suggesting what metrics could be for each of these. But some of the metrics that they have, the categories that they're looking at are, we'll reward you for energy efficiency, for interconnection, for affordability, for customer engagement. And again, data access, or we reward you for reducing demand. So this just gives you some sense. And the one I think that is probably the more revolutionary, or it has an opportunity to change the way the utilities do business, is market-based earnings. So these are ways utilities can earn revenue other than just kilowatt-hour sales. Okay, so it's a long-term option proposed to replace lost revenue from the shrinking rate base. And so these are just some examples, by the way, that I've put up, but there aren't necessarily been set by the commission. But the first one is basic platform services. So they'll earn some revenue for scheduling and dispatch and transaction. But then there are value-added platform services. So these could be things like, there's been a lot of talk in New York now about setting up something like a kayak equivalent for a customer portal. So a customer can go to one site throughout the whole state of New York. They can compare contractors, compare pricing, and maybe the utility does advertising on that site, or maybe they get a customer referral, and that gives additional revenue. The third one is competitive services. So this would be something that not just the monopoly would offer, but third-party entities could provide as well. Maybe there's a customer out there that wants added reliability, and the utility says, okay, I'll give you a microgrid engineering, and I'll get additional revenue for that. Or they might say, all this great data that I have as a utility, I'm going to take it and analyze it for you so you don't have tons and tons of data, but I'll analyze it and you'll have to pay a little bit of a premium for that. And so again, additional revenue can come into the utility. So these are just examples. A lot of the MBEs that are being discussed still have yet to be fleshed out, and this is much longer term, but the goal is to give you a sense of where things might go in the future in terms of market-based earning things sort of outside of the rate base. So then in addition to a number of demonstration programs, the one that I wanted to highlight, and you probably have already heard about it, is the Brooklyn-Queens Demand Management Program. This is something that I think is sort of indicative of where the commission would like to go. So they want to move beyond technology business models and innovation, but more focused on the business itself and how do you change the business structure. So Con Ed wanted to invest about $1 billion in a distribution system upgrade. And the commission came back and said, look, we don't want you to do that. If you can find, we will authorize you to spend $200 million to procure non-wires solutions like solar, like storage, like energy efficiency. And if you do that well, and you meet some of these metrics here, like the megawatts deployed, or the cost effectiveness, or third-party engagement, we will give you 100 basis points adder. So this is just an example that I wanted to show how things are shifting a little bit in New York to try to incent a different way of doing business, to encourage distributed energy resources. The thing I wanted to also highlight is why I think New York is working so far. I mean, the jury's still out, right? There's a lot that still has to be defined. There's still a lot of unknown questions. But the reason it's getting so much attention in the United States, and I think more globally, like a lot of eyes right now are on New York, is one, you've got a lot of things aligned that are making this movement happen. One is you've got Chair Zibelman. Audrey Zibelman is very passionate about this, and she's very committed to this at the commission level. You've got the head of Governor Cuomo's energy office, Richard Kaufman, very aligned as well and working side by side with the commission. You've got the utilities recognizing that there is benefit to looking at different ways of getting revenue. And so, you combine these three things, and that's quite an exciting opportunity. They just announced November last month that they're going to require the utilities to procure 50% renewable energy by 2030. So again, another target that's being pushed. But I think New York is sort of an exciting opportunity, and as many of the other states are too, but I think this one has the potential for really taking a very different look at utility reform. So let's shift gears a little bit now to Canada. Obviously, Canada and the United States and the provinces versus the states are very different. But there are some similarities to make, I think, between the different provinces and the states. One, I think that there is a need for infrastructure investments. I think also the consumer trends are that there is, resiliency needs in many locations. Their customers are demanding greater customer control, and they want flexibility and options. And then clearly in both places there's a need to address climate change. There are still a lot of questions that have to be addressed. This is not going to be a simple road We are struggling weekly dealing with the issues that are coming up. Some of these are just the questions that I think that you're probably going to have to deal with as well. What's the role of a regulated entity versus the competitive marketplace? Or what's the role of the utility versus the competitive marketplace? In many ways, the utilities have a competitive advantage, and you want to make sure there's a fair playing field for the third-party entities that are coming in. How do you make the utilities more innovative? A lot of these companies have been doing business as usual for 100 years without much change, and they're resistant to innovation. And so I think that has to be addressed as well. How do you provide access to the customer and system data? This is a big deal for companies like yourselves that need that data to understand where on the feeder do I want to put that solar system to get the best value and the best price for it. You've got to have access to that data that the utility has. Utilities are saying, you know what, there's privacy issues, there's security issue with the feeder. We're not sure we want to share it. So that's something that has to be overcome. And then what is the right benefit cost framework? I think all of us recognize there's been a lot of discussions about how do you value solar, for example. It hasn't been properly monetized. Many people think there's a lot of benefits that aren't typically factored into the traditional benefit cost analysis that's being done. And so we've got to come up with a new framework for doing that. There are a lot of benefits. If we get this right, there are a lot of benefits to the industry and to the utility sector. One is I think it will result in more sustained emission reductions in the long run. In addition to what's happening federally, we have to be doing things at the state level and the province level. And I think some of these activities around utility reform will help make that happen. It will result ultimately in a more flexible, efficient, and resilient grid that can accommodate these new end-use technologies. This two-way power flow. Eventually, those solar systems will have load management capabilities and storage more cost-effectively integrated. And they can be not a burden to the system, but actually help the grid. And we have to find ways to facilitate that in the business models. There is obviously a role for potentially longer-term financial viability. I mean, if the utilities don't somehow get more engaged in this, the third-party entities are coming up with these products and services all the time, and it's going to happen. We just have to find a way that it becomes a win-win for the utilities as well as the third-party providers. And there has to be a role, an expanded role, for the third-party entities, because I think they can provide some of the innovation that is needed to help support the grid and make it better moving forward. And then ultimately, if you have the customers more engaged with more information, ability to interact more, getting more what they want, if a customer wants more resiliency and they can get it now and maybe pay a premium for it, they'll be a happier customer because they're getting more of a targeted product and service that they want. And then finally, just some recommendations based on our experience. I have to say the one thing that I think has been so critical to getting as far as we have gotten in some of these states is sitting side by side with the utilities and the stakeholders in the same room, not in huge crowds of 200 to 300 people, but in small settings of 20, 25 people, getting the key players around the room, Chatham House rules, no press, really getting into some of the more difficult discussions. And I think there's value in the larger stakeholder discussions and the smaller ones, but I think the key thing is getting utilities and the stakeholders together to cooperate. And also to make sure that what you're doing at the province level is aligned with what's going on federally. And we see that too. Is there a way, the 21st century electricity system at the state level definitely feeds into the Clean Power Plan in the United States. And I think here you have the same issues where you've got to make sure what's going on at the province level will coordinate and be in sync with the policies at the federal level. I have seen in New York that it's so important to have a champion. New York would not be where it is on the REV proceeding, and one would argue, is it far enough? But I tell you, they're dealing with very challenging issues. And Chair Zibelman has been key, I think, as well as Richard, in terms of moving it forward. If you didn't have a champion, it would never be where it is today. I think there has to be an encouragement about the utility data. That's an important piece for everything to succeed around utility reform. And I just want to end with saying, look, there's no silver bullet. You know, I think there are criticisms of what's being done at REV, and there's criticisms what's being done. You know, there's always people who are skeptical. But the opportunity and the successes could be quite significant. And there are going to be mistakes. There's no question, you know, and I think we all recognize that. So we've got to be patient because there's no silver bullet. There's no easy answers. You know, the utility sector has been doing business one way for about 100 plus years. It's not going to change overnight, but I'm hopeful that if we get it right, there's a huge opportunity for everyone in the room here, as well as the utilities, and we can make this a win-win situation. So with that, I'll close and take any questions if you'd like.
Yeah, no, stay here.
Okay.
I think, you know, I've got the difficult job here of having to do what I'm told. And Patrick Bateman tells me we just have time for 1 or 2 questions at the most. Actually, he told me 1, but I'm using some executive decision making here. So one or that's the extent of my power. So 1 or 2 questions. If you just want to get up to the mic, if you've got a question for Lisa, please feel free. Somehow I knew Nigel was going to make it.
It's my last chance. Lisa, thank you very much for a very informative talk. You closed with a statement saying there will be mistakes made. And I wonder if there's perhaps a better marketing spin we could put on that, which is that we need to encourage lots of experimentation.
Yeah.
And that inevitably will have some good results and perhaps some less good results. But I think the motivation and incenting for change and trying new things is what I'd like to see. So do you agree with that?
I totally agree with that. I think that's an excellent point, you know, because I think we have to experiment because there's so many paths that we could go down. And I think the question is, which is going to be the one where we're going to have a win-win as much? And I think you're right. I maybe shouldn't frame it as a negative that there are going to be mistakes, but and more that, you know, you have to take risks. And I think the reality is that there will be a huge opportunity to learn from those risks that have been taken and to learn from lessons learned. And I think the only other thing I would make is that we should be cooperating in the information that we're getting in one state versus the next or in one province versus the next, because there's a lot of lessons that can be learned instead of everybody reinventing the wheel as well. But I totally agree with your comment. Yes?
Our last question here. Thank you.
Hi, Lisa. My name is Mike Jessup from the Ministry of Energy. I've been following the REV program, been reading the Track 2 white paper by the staff. A little bit general for my liking, but I see there's been a tremendous number of responses. I was hoping that I could segue into a comment you made earlier as to what are the major criticisms, what are the major or sort of the skeptical sort of views on the REV process at this time, instead of me going through about 1 million white papers by associations and LDCs and the sort.
Okay, well, first of all, I would encourage many of you to go to our website because we do have a lot of the formal comments that our members have filed that are all free. Anybody can read them. They're easy to access. Go on to Advanced Energy Economy. But, you know, I think the issues have been, some people have been criticizing it for not moving fast enough. Some people have been criticizing it for moving too fast. So, you know, there's a lot of stakeholders that have been, like they had, during the first stakeholder meeting, they had like 300 people coming to that. And to try to manage that volume of environmentalists versus ratepayer advocacy versus utilities versus our business association, it was a lot to handle. I think, like you, people are maybe wanting more specifics and more details, but I think what the commission is trying to do is say, look, we don't necessarily have all the answers. We want to hear from you and work on this together. And so, you know, I think the Track 2, there are specifics about MBEs, market-based earnings, and there are discussion about LMP plus D, but there aren't more specifics. And I think, frankly, that's the kind of criticism we've been hearing, but the reality is they've made it clear that I think 2016 is going to be a key year where a lot of this has to be fleshed out. And now we're getting to the point where, the rubber meets the road, and we've got to get at a lot of these difficult, challenging issues, because now we're getting to the point where there's not going to be easy consensus or easy alignment. And, we're already in the midst of trying to work with solar companies and the utilities to talk about, okay, what is that transition from where we are to maybe LMP plus D? How long do you keep net metering, and how does that evolve with time? So those are, there are also many other issues that people are questioning about. I think the other one that's a question, in our comments, we file some of our concerns. I think, we are questioning how much leeway you give utilities to play in some of these competitive markets, right? Because they do have a competitive advantage, and you want a fair playing field. And so it's still unclear what's the role of the utility versus the third-party entities in some of these new platform services that they're defining. And so all that stuff has to be still ironed out. So I think I'm done with time, but thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much. Lisa.
Sure.
That was terrific.
Good.
Really. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lisa. This is a dynamic industry and full of very hard-working players who really need opportunities like this to lift their heads up once in a while from their desks and understand what is going on in other jurisdictions around the world. Clearly, what you've outlined for us and the activities that are happening in the United States, across the United States, offer valuable lessons that we need here, especially now that Ontario is going further down the road towards this net metering future, looking at how the LDC business model is going to evolve, and looking at how regulators and the rest of the stakeholders fit into that. So thank you for that.